There is a truth that few families dare to say out loud. Not every problem between parents and children comes from upbringing. Not every relational difficulty is the result of childhood trauma or parental mistakes. Sometimes, despite having given love, reasonable boundaries, and consistent attention, you find yourself facing a child who operates from a completely different pattern. A child who cannot accept responsibility, who lacks genuine empathy, who manipulates constantly, who needs to be the center of the family universe, not because you failed as a parent, but because narcissism developed as the central structure of their personality, and recognizing that, admitting that, confronting that, is one of the most painful experiences a parent can face. Because culture trains you to believe that if your child has problems, it is your fault. That if they show destructive behaviors, it is because you did not give enough love, enough attention, enough resources. That every problem in a child is a direct reflection of parental failure. But that is not true. Not all psychopathology is caused by upbringing. Some personality patterns develop despite reasonable parenting, and narcissism is one of them. Marcus Aurelius, who was a father as well as an emperor, wrote something about accepting difficult realities about those close to us. Accept people as they are, not as you wish them to be. And when you accept their true nature, you stop torturing yourself trying to change what is not under your control. This does not mean giving up on your child. It does not mean abandoning all hope of a healthy relationship. It means recognizing, with brutal honesty, what you are actually facing, not the idealized version of who you wish they were, but the reality of how they operate now. Because as long as you operate from denial, as long as you keep believing that if I just find the right way to reach them, they will change, you will remain trapped in destructive cycles. Cycles where you give more, where you justify unacceptable behavior, where you blame yourself for patterns you did not cause. And that cycle does not only destroy you, it perpetuates the very narcissistic patterns that need to be confronted. Seneca, who was also a father, wrote something specific about relationships with people incapable of reciprocity. Do not waste your life trying to draw water from a dry well. Recognize when someone is incapable of giving what you need and adjust your expectations to that reality. This sounds harsh when it is your own child, but it is exactly the clarity you need if you are dealing with real narcissism. Because a narcissistic child does not operate from the same emotional structure you do. They do not process relationships the same way. They do not experience responsibility the same way. They do not experience empathy the same way. And as long as you keep expecting them to respond as if they did, you will remain hurt, confused, and blaming yourself. Epictetus taught something radical about relationships with narcissistic people. Do not expect the blind to see, do not expect the deaf to hear, and do not expect someone who lacks the capacity for genuine empathy to respond with empathy, no matter how much you ask. The narcissistic child does not lack empathy because you failed to teach it. They lack empathy because their narcissistic personality structure prevents the development of genuine empathy. That is not your fault. It is their reality. And recognizing that reality is not giving up, it is beginning to operate from clarity instead of denial. What follows are 10 specific signs that identify real narcissism in a child. Not normal, adolescent tantrums, not temporary developmental rebellion, not childhood egocentrism that fades with maturity, but persistent patterns that indicate a narcissistic personality structure. These signs are not comfortable to recognize, because admitting that your child operates from narcissism is admitting that the relationship you have is not the relationship you imagined, that it will likely never be the relationship you hoped for, that it will require stricter boundaries than you ever wanted to set. But that painful admission is exactly the first step toward protecting yourself from constant manipulation, and toward establishing the only kind of relationship that can work with a narcissistic person, one based on firm boundaries, not on hope for fundamental change. Before continuing, before we explore the 10 signs that will give you devastating clarity, you need to do more than listen passively. You need to declare a specific commitment, not a private thought you forget when guilt arises for judging your child. Not a vague intention that dissolves when they manipulate you with tears or explosions. A public declaration that creates real accountability. Go to the comments right now and write exactly this. I see the reality of who they are, not the fantasy of who I want them to be. Those words are not abandonment of your child. They are your acknowledgement that you have been operating from denial, trying to change patterns outside your control, blaming yourself for behaviors you did not cause, and that you have decided that seeing reality clearly, as painful as it is better than remaining in destructive denial. Do it now. Pause this audio. Go to the comments. Write, I see the reality of who they are, not the fantasy of who I want them to be. That act of public declaration makes your commitment to clarity real in a way private thought never does. The Stoics understood the power of naming uncomfortable truths publicly. They knew that when you declare something externally, when you make it visible, you create a force that dramatically multiplies your ability to act according to that truth. Because it is no longer just a private suspicion you can deny when your child momentarily behaves differently. It is a recognition others have seen, and that visibility creates accountability that transforms observation into action. This is not an exercise in cruelly pathologizing your child. It is not an excuse to give up or abandon them. It is an honest recognition of specific patterns that indicate real narcissism. Because only when you recognize what you are truly facing can you protect yourself from manipulation and establish the boundaries that are necessary. And those boundaries are not punishment. They are the only sustainable form of relationship with a narcissistic person. First sign: they never accept responsibility for their mistakes. There is an absolute difference between someone who makes mistakes and struggles to admit them, and someone who literally cannot admit error at all. The narcissistic child belongs to the second category. No matter how obvious the mistake is, no matter how much evidence you have, no matter how many people confirm what happened, you will never hear a genuine, "I was wrong." Because admitting error for the narcissistic mind is not simply recognizing that they did something wrong. It is completely destroying the perfect image they have built of themselves as the center of the universe. And that destruction is literally intolerable to their psychological structure. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people incapable of accepting responsibility. The one who never admits being wrong is not strong. He is fragile. So fragile that the smallest acknowledgement of imperfection threatens to shatter his entire identity. That fragility is exactly what drives the narcissistic inability to accept responsibility. It is not strength, it is weakness disguised as arrogance. Because a genuinely secure person can admit mistakes without their identity collapsing. A narcissistic person cannot. Their identity depends entirely on maintaining the illusion of perfection. So, when something goes wrong, you will observe a specific and predictable pattern. First, direct denial. That never happened. That's not how it was. You're remembering it wrong. If direct denial does not work because there is undeniable evidence, the second step is minimization. It wasn't that bad. You're exaggerating. You're too sensitive. If minimization does not work, the third step is deflection. But you also, if you hadn't done X, I wouldn't have. And what about when you? If deflection does not work, the fourth step is victimization. You're always attacking me. Nothing I do is ever enough for you. No matter what I do, it's always wrong. And if none of that works, the final step is explosion or dramatic withdrawal. Disproportionate rage that makes continuing the conversation impossible, or punitive silence that punishes you for daring to point out their mistake. What never happens in that entire cycle is genuine acceptance of responsibility. Never a sincere, "You're right, I was wrong. I'm truly sorry." Seneca observed this in narcissistic individuals in Rome. The one who invests more energy in avoiding admission of error than it would take to correct the error itself reveals something devastating. Their image matters more than the truth. That is exactly the pattern of the narcissistic child. The massive energy invested in avoiding responsibility, elaborate justifications, alternative narratives, defensive explosions, requires far more effort than simply admitting, "I was wrong." But admitting error is impossible, because their narcissistic structure does not allow them to see their own mistakes without identity collapse. Epictetus taught something specific about relating to people like this. Do not expect someone who cannot accept responsibility to change because you ask with enough clarity. Inability is not lack of understanding. It is structure of personality. This is critical to understand. It is not that your narcissistic child doesn't understand that they should accept responsibility. It is that their narcissistic structure makes that acceptance impossible without destroying their self-image. And preserving the perfect self-image matters more to them than any relationship, any truth, any consequence. The practice that reveals whether this pattern is present in your child is uncomfortable but clarifying. Think about the last 5 times your child made a clear and undeniable mistake. How many of those times did they accept genuine responsibility without deflection, without justification, without becoming the victim? If the honest answer is none, or maybe once under extreme pressure, but they retracted it later, you are seeing this narcissistic pattern. Not normal adolescent rebellion, not temporary immaturity, but a structural inability to accept responsibility. Marcus Aurelius also warned about the cost of relating to people like this. The one who never accepts responsibility will make you responsible for everything. Because their world does not allow them to be the source of problems, someone else must be. This explains why you feel constantly guilty in the relationship with your narcissistic child. Not because you truly are the source of all the problems, but because their inability to accept responsibility requires someone else to carry it. And as a parent, you are the easiest target onto whom all responsibility is projected. Every conflict becomes your fault. Every problem is the result of your failures. Every difficulty exists because you never understood them. And if you accept that narrative, if you internalize that guilt, You perpetuate the very pattern that keeps them narcissistic. Because you confirm their story. They are perfect. You are the problem. Seneca closed his observations on this with something brutal. The person who is never responsible for anything never grows. Because growth requires recognizing mistakes and learning from them, and whoever cannot do the first is incapable of the second. That is the tragedy of the narcissistic child. They do not only harm you with their inability to accept responsibility, they harm themselves. Because without the ability to recognize mistakes, they cannot learn, grow, or genuinely mature. They remain stuck in destructive patterns while blaming the world for the consequences of their own actions. And you cannot change that. No matter how much you try, how much you explain, how much you model responsibility, because it is not lack of example. It is a personality structure that does not allow what would be required for change. Second sign: complete lack of genuine empathy. There is a devastating difference between someone who has empathy but sometimes fails to express it, and someone who fundamentally lacks the capacity for genuine empathy. The narcissistic child belongs to the second category. They cannot genuinely put themselves in another person's shoes. They cannot feel another's pain as their own. They cannot prioritize someone else's well-being over their own convenience. Not because they don't want to, but because their narcissistic structure prevents the development of real empathy. And this shows up in specific ways you have likely experienced repeatedly. When you share something painful you are going through, you do not receive empathy. You receive one of three responses. Minimization. It's not that bad. Other people have it worse. At least it's not. Deflection back to themselves. You think you have it hard. Let me tell you what I'm going through. Or total indifference, a change of subject, a shallow response, glassy eyes that reveal they are not processing your experience at all. What you never receive is genuine empathy. Real presence with your pain. Recognition that what you feel matters. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people incapable of empathy. The one who cannot feel another's suffering is not strong. He is empty. And that emptiness, where basic human connection should exist, is exactly what makes him incapable of genuine relationships. That is the tragedy of the narcissist. They do not only cause pain through lack of empathy. They live without the deep connection that empathy makes possible. So all their relationships are superficial, transactional, based on what others can do for them. Never genuine, never deep, never grounded in real emotional connection. Seneca observed this specifically in narcissistic individuals. The one who can only see the world from his own perspective lives in a prison of one, and that prison is lonelier than any physical cell. But the narcissistic child does not experience that loneliness the way you would, because their lack of empathy means they do not crave genuine connection the way empathic people do. They crave admiration, attention, validation of their superiority, but they do not crave being deeply known, unconditionally loved, fully accepted, because those experiences require vulnerability, and vulnerability requires admitting imperfection, and admitting imperfection destroys the narcissistic self-image. Epictetus taught something specific about recognizing lack of empathy. A person with empathy can disagree with you and still recognize that your experience is valid. A person without empathy can only see your experience as wrong if it differs from their own. This is exactly what you experience with a narcissistic child. They do not simply disagree with your perspective. They completely invalidate your experience. You shouldn't feel that way. You're being irrational. You're overreacting. Each of these statements denies the validity of your inner experience, because for the narcissist, only their experience is real and valid. Yours is wrong if it does not match theirs. The practice that reveals whether your child lacks genuine empathy is brutally clear. Remember the last times you shared real vulnerability with them, genuine pain, serious difficulty. Did they respond with empathic presence, with "that must be very hard for you," with space for your experience without making it about them? Or did they respond with minimization, deflection back to themselves, or direct invalidation of your experience? If it is the second, consistently, you are not seeing a temporary lack of social skill. You are seeing a structural absence of empathy that defines narcissism. Marcus Aurelius also recognized the specific pain of loving someone incapable of empathy. To love someone who cannot feel your love in the way you give it is one of the loneliest experiences, because you give from depth to someone who can only receive superficially. That is exactly your experience as the parent of a narcissistic child. You give deep, unconditional love, rooted in real connection. They receive it only as confirmation that they are special, superior, deserving of admiration, not as genuine love between two people who know and accept each other, but as appropriate tribute to their grandiosity. And the more you give while expecting emotional reciprocity, the emptier you feel, because you are giving to someone incapable of reciprocating emotionally. Seneca closed on this with a specific warning. Do not expect someone who lacks empathy to develop empathy because you model it perfectly. Empathy is not learned by imitation when the basic capacity is absent. This destroys the hope many parents hold. If I just show enough empathy, eventually they will learn to be empathetic. But narcissistic absence of empathy is not lack of example. It is structural incapacity. And no amount of modeling will change that. What you can do is adjust your expectations to the reality of their incapacity. Do not expect empathy where it cannot exist. Do not share deep vulnerability with someone who cannot honor it. Do not seek genuine emotional connection where only superficial transaction exists. That is not giving up. It is protecting yourself from constant injury caused by expecting the impossible. Third sign, constant manipulation through guilt. The narcissistic child is a master of one specific skill, turning any situation into your fault. It does not matter what actually happened. It does not matter who caused the problem. It does not matter how clear the responsibility is. By the end of the conversation, somehow, you feel guilty. Guilty for pointing out their mistake. Guilty for having needs. Guilty for setting boundaries. And that guilt is not accidental. It is deliberate manipulation designed to keep you controlled. Marcus Aurelius wrote about people who use guilt as a weapon. The manipulator turns your goodness into weakness. He uses your capacity to feel guilt as the tool to control you. And the more virtuous you are, the more vulnerable you become to that manipulation. This explains why the best parents often suffer the most with narcissistic children, not because they are worse parents, but because their genuine capacity for guilt makes them perfect targets for manipulation. The narcissistic child learns early that certain phrases reliably trigger guilt in you. After everything I've done for you, nothing is ever enough for you. Other parents wouldn't treat their children this way. You always make me feel like I'm not enough. Each of these statements is designed specifically to generate guilt that will stop your boundary, your confrontation, your legitimate need. And they work. Because you are a parent who genuinely cares, who genuinely wants to do the right thing, who genuinely fears harming your child. So when they suggest that you are harming them simply by having basic needs or setting reasonable limits, your guilt activates. And in that state of guilt, you retract the boundary. You minimize your need. You apologize for things that require no apology, exactly as they intended. Seneca observed this precisely. The expert manipulator does not control you with force. He controls you by convincing you that you are the one acting wrongly when you resist his control. That is the perversity of guilt-based manipulation. It does not feel like you are being controlled. It feels like you are being selfish, harsh, unfair. So you correct yourself. You retract your limits. You give more. You demand less. All while believing you are being a better parent, when in reality, you are being a manipulated one. Epictetus taught something radical about freeing yourself from guilt manipulation. Ask yourself, does this guilt come from violating my genuine values or from disappointing irrational expectations of others? If you violated your genuine values, the guilt is appropriate. Correct yourself. But if you merely disappointed unreasonable expectations, the guilt is manipulation. Resist it. The narcissistic child is an expert at blurring that distinction. They make you feel that setting basic boundaries violates your values as a parent, that having needs of your own is unforgivable selfishness, that not sacrificing everything constantly is abandonment of your parental role. And if you believe those narratives, you live in perpetual guilt over things that are completely reasonable. The practice that reveals whether you are being manipulated through guilt is uncomfortable but clarifying. Think about the last times you set a boundary with your child or expressed a need. How did they respond? Did they respect the boundary even if it made them uncomfortable? Or did they immediately make you feel guilty for having set it? Did they acknowledge your need as legitimate, even if they did not want to meet it? Or did they make you feel selfish for having it? If the answer is consistently the second, you are being manipulated through guilt, not occasionally, not under stress, but as a predictable pattern every time you do not give exactly what they want. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific against guilt manipulation. Before accepting guilt, he asked himself, did I violate a principle I genuinely hold? Or did I simply fail to meet expectations I never accepted as reasonable? If it was the first, he corrected his behavior. If it was the second, he rejected the guilt, regardless of how much pressure he received to accept it. Because he understood that accepting inappropriate guilt did not make him virtuous. It made him manipulable. Seneca also warned specifically, the one who accepts guilt for everything eventually loses the ability to distinguish real responsibility from manipulation, and that confusion turns him into a slave of expert manipulators. That slavery is exactly what the narcissistic child seeks. Not a genuine relationship where both people have needs and limits, but a dynamic where you exist to serve their needs without limits. And every time you accept inappropriate guilt, you reinforce that dynamic. You teach them that generating guilt in you works perfectly to get what they want, so they will use that tool more frequently, more skillfully, more ruthlessly, until you live in near constant guilt simply for existing with needs of your own. Epictetus closed on this with a precise instruction. When someone tries to make you feel guilty, immediately ask, what are they trying to achieve by generating this guilt in me? The answer will reveal whether the guilt is legitimate or manipulation. In the case of the narcissistic child, the answer is almost always the same. They want you to retract your boundary, ignore your need, or apologize for something reasonable. And when you see that intention clearly, the guilt loses its power, because you recognize that it is not a signal that you did something wrong. It is a tool of control they use expertly. And your task is not to feel guilty for resisting control. It is to maintain reasonable boundaries, no matter how much guilt they try to generate. Fourth sign: needs to be the center of attention at all times. There is a fundamental difference between someone who enjoys attention occasionally and someone who cannot tolerate not being the center of the universe in every context. The narcissistic child belongs to the second category. It does not matter where they are. It does not matter what is happening. It does not matter who else legitimately needs attention. They must be the protagonist, always. And when they are not, when someone else receives legitimate attention, you will see a specific, predictable pattern. First, interruption. Constantly. They cannot allow a conversation about someone else to continue without redirecting it back to themselves. Someone is sharing an important experience. They interrupt with, "That reminds me of when I..." And suddenly the conversation is about them. Someone is sharing an achievement. They interrupt with, "I did something similar, but better." And the focus shifts. Someone needs emotional support. They interrupt with, "You think that's hard? Let me tell you what I'm dealing with." And now everyone is listening to them. Second, if interruption does not work, they divert the conversation with questions that appear interested but are designed to pull the focus back to them. "What did you think about what I said earlier about? Did you see what I posted about? Did I tell you what happened to me yesterday?" Each question is bait meant to drag attention back to them. Third, if diversion does not work, they generate conflict or drama that forces everyone to attend to them. An emotional explosion, an accusation, a dramatic exit, a shocking announcement. Anything that guarantees all eyes return to them. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people with an insatiable need for attention. The one who cannot tolerate others shining reveals something devastating. His sense of worth depends entirely on being the brightest in the room, and that dependence makes him a slave to constant comparison. That slavery is exactly what drives the narcissistic need for constant attention. It is not genuine confidence. It is deep insecurity disguised as grandiosity, because someone who is genuinely secure can celebrate the success of others without feeling threatened. They can allow others to have the spotlight without experiencing it as personal loss. They can exist without being the constant protagonist, because their worth does not depend on external attention. But the narcissistic child cannot. Their worth depends entirely on being admired, seen, recognized as special. So every moment in which they are not the center is experienced as an existential threat. Seneca observed this specifically in narcissistic individuals in Rome. The one who needs to be applauded constantly can never simply be. He lives perpetually performing for real or imagined audiences. And that constant performance is a prison stricter than any cell. That is the tragedy of the narcissist. They do not only exhaust others with their insatiable need for attention, they exhaust themselves. because they can never relax, never be genuine, never exist without constantly evaluating. Are they looking at me? Do they admire me? Am I the most important one here? And when the answer is no, they enter internal panic that manifests as the behaviors you see: interruption, diversion, conflict creation. Epictetus taught something specific about relating to people like this. The one who needs constant attention is like a bottomless well. You can give attention endlessly, and it will never be enough, because the need does not come from external lack, but from an internal void that no amount of attention can fill. This is critical to understand. It is not that if you give your narcissistic child enough attention, they will eventually be satisfied. The need is insatiable because it comes from personality structure, not real deprivation. You can give them all your attention, all your admiration, all your validation, and they will still need more, because narcissistic need for attention has no point of saturation. The practice that reveals whether this pattern is present is brutally clear. Observe what happens in family contexts when someone other than your narcissistic child receives positive attention. A sibling shares an achievement. A parent tells a story. A visitor becomes the focus of conversation. Can your narcissistic child allow that person to have the spotlight without intervening? Can they listen genuinely without making everything about themselves? Can they celebrate someone else's success without minimizing it, competing with it, or redirecting attention? If the honest answer is no, if they consistently must be the center, you are not seeing a normal need for attention. You are seeing pathological narcissistic need that defines their personality structure. Marcus Aurelius also recognized the specific cost of relating to people like this. The one who needs to be the center at all times turns every relationship into a performance for himself. There is never space for others to simply exist. Everything must serve his need to be seen as special. That is exactly your experience as a parent. Family conversations are not genuine exchanges. They are stages for self-display. Family events are not about shared connection. They are about ensuring they receive maximum attention. The achievements of other family members are not celebrated. They are threats to be minimized or surpassed, because everything must serve their need to be the constant protagonist. And the more you satisfy that need, the more insatiable it becomes. Seneca closed on this with a devastating warning. The one who feeds an insatiable need eventually becomes completely exhausted, because he is giving endlessly to someone who can never receive enough. That is your reality if you have a child with this narcissistic need. No matter how much attention you give, it will never be enough. So your task is not to satisfy the need. It is to set limits on how much of your energy you will give to something insatiable, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. Because if you devote your entire life to being an audience for their constant performance, you will have no energy left for your own life, and they will never be satisfied anyway. Fifth sign: reacts with disproportionate rage to criticism. There is an absolute difference between someone who struggles with criticism but eventually processes it, and someone who literally cannot tolerate criticism without collapsing into rage or victimhood. The narcissistic child belongs to the second category. The smallest criticism, the most constructive, the most lovingly expressed, is received as a devastating personal attack. And the reaction is completely disproportionate to the content of the criticism. You point out that they forgot to do something they agreed to do. They explode. You mention that their tone was hurtful. They become aggressively defensive. You suggest a different way of handling a situation. They accuse you of never being satisfied. In every case, the reaction does not match the criticism. Because for the narcissistic mind, criticism is not useful information about specific behavior. It is a total attack on their imagined perfection. It is intolerable evidence that they are not as special as they need to believe they are. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people incapable of receiving criticism. The wise person receives criticism as a gift, even when it hurts, because he prefers uncomfortable truth to comfortable illusion. The insecure person receives criticism as an existential threat, because his fragile identity cannot tolerate evidence of imperfection. That fragility is exactly what drives narcissistic rage in response to criticism. It is not strength defending principles. It is fragility defending illusion. Because a genuinely secure person can hear, "You did this wrong," without interpreting it as, "You are completely defective." They can separate specific behavior from total identity. But the narcissist cannot. For them, criticism of behavior is rejection of their entire being. So they respond with the fury of someone defending their existence, not merely defending an action. Seneca observed this precisely. The one who explodes at the smallest criticism reveals that his self-image is so fragile that the slightest pressure threatens to shatter it completely. That fragility explains why walking on eggshells becomes your normal way of operating. You learn that any criticism, no matter how necessary or carefully expressed, will trigger an explosion. So, you stop criticizing. You stop pointing out problems. You stop expressing needs that might imply they did something less than perfectly. You live in silence about things that should be said because you have learned that the cost of saying them is disproportionate rage. Epictetus taught something specific about this. The one who cannot tolerate criticism cannot grow. Because growth requires recognizing what needs improvement, and the one who reacts with rage to all criticism condemns himself to perpetual stagnation. That is the tragedy of the narcissistic child. They do not only harm you with their rage toward criticism, they harm themselves because, without the ability to receive feedback, they cannot learn, adjust, or genuinely improve. They remain trapped in the same destructive patterns because all evidence that they need to change is violently rejected. The practice that reveals whether this pattern is present is painfully simple. Think about the last time you gave your child constructive criticism about something specific and real, not an attack, not an insult. Legitimate feedback about a behavior that needed to be addressed. How did they respond? Did they listen, process it, perhaps defend themselves initially but eventually acknowledge at least part of the criticism? Or did they immediately explode in rage? Victimize themselves by saying, "You always attack me," deflect toward your faults, slam doors and disappear? If it is consistently the second, you are not seeing temporarily heightened sensitivity. You are seeing structural narcissistic incapacity to tolerate criticism without collapsing into rage or victimhood. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific when he encountered people like this. He gave the criticism once clearly and directly. If it was received with disproportionate rage, he did not repeat it. Not because he retracted the observation, but because he recognized that the person was incapable of receiving it. And repeating criticism to someone who cannot receive it changes nothing except increasing conflict. So he adjusted his expectations. This person cannot grow through direct feedback because their structure does not allow it. Seneca also warned specifically, "Do not waste your energy trying to teach someone who punishes all teaching. The one who reacts with rage to correction does not want to grow. He wants to be validated in his stagnation." That is exactly what the narcissistic child wants. Not honest feedback that would help them improve. Constant validation that they are already perfect. And every time you retract necessary criticism to avoid their rage, you give them exactly that. You confirm that their rage works perfectly to silence uncomfortable truths. So, they will use that rage more frequently, more intensely, more strategically, until you live completely silenced, unable to point out anything that needs to be addressed. Epictetus closed on this with a radical instruction. If someone reacts with rage to a necessary truth, speak the truth anyway, not out of cruelty, but because your silence does not help them. It only preserves the illusion that keeps them stuck. This does not mean attacking. It does not mean destructive criticism. It means expressing necessary observations honestly, even when they provoke rage. Because your silence does not preserve the relationship. It only preserves dysfunction. And in the long run, preserving dysfunction causes more damage than the temporary fury that truth may provoke. Sixth sign. Has an exaggerated sense of superiority. The narcissistic child does not simply have confidence in their abilities or pride in their achievements. They hold a genuine belief that they are fundamentally better than other people, not in specific areas. In essence, they believe they are more intelligent, more special, more important, more deserving than ordinary people. And that belief does not come from real achievements that would justify elevated confidence. It comes from a narcissistic need to see themselves as superior in order to maintain a grandiose self-image. This shows up in specific ways you have likely heard repeatedly. They speak about others with obvious contempt. Those people don't understand. They're not on my level. They're too simple to get it. They refer to people as inferior categories rather than as individuals with inherent worth. They assume their opinions are obviously correct and others' opinions are obviously wrong, not because there is evidence, but because they think something and therefore it must be superior to what others think. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people with inflated superiority. The one who needs to feel superior to others reveals deep insecurity, because the genuinely secure person does not need constant comparison. He can recognize value in others without experiencing it as a threat to his own. That is the paradox of the narcissist. They present themselves as supremely confident, but the constant need to feel superior reveals massive insecurity, because genuine confidence does not require constant comparison. It can coexist with the recognition that others also have value, skills, and importance. But narcissistic superiority cannot tolerate that recognition, because if others are also valuable, they are not unique. If others are also capable, they are not special. And not being unique and special destroys their grandiose self-image. Seneca observed this precisely. The one who can only feel good by belittling others can never feel genuinely good, because he has tied his worth to constant comparison instead of inner quality. That is the prison of the narcissist. Their worth depends entirely on being superior to others, so they must constantly find ways to belittle, minimize, or despise those around them. They cannot simply exist with intrinsic value. They must constantly prove themselves superior. and that constant need for proof is exhausting for everyone around them. Epictetus taught something specific about relating to people like this. The one who genuinely believes he is superior to you cannot relate to you genuinely. Because genuine relationship requires mutual recognition of shared humanity. And the one who sees you as inferior sees an object, not a person. That is exactly your experience as a parent of a narcissistic child. They do not treat you as a person of equal value. They treat you as inferior, whose role is to serve them, admire them, validate their superiority. Your opinions are dismissed. Your experiences are minimized. Your needs are irrelevant, because in their mind, you exist for their benefit, not as a person with equivalent worth. The practice that reveals whether this pattern is present is uncomfortable. Listen to how your child speaks about other people when they are not present. Do they speak about them with basic respect, even when acknowledging differences or disagreements? Or do they speak with contempt, with mockery, as if others are fundamentally inferior? Do they use language that categorizes people as less than? Those people, that kind of person, the ones who don't understand. If it is consistently the second, you are not seeing normal confidence or healthy discernment between better and worse behavior. You are seeing narcissistic superiority that divides the world into me who is special and everyone else who is inferior. Marcus Aurelius also recognized the cost of relating to people like this. The one who sees you as inferior will never truly listen to you, because listening requires respect. And the one who believes he is superior cannot respect someone he sees as beneath him. That explains the futility of trying to reason with a narcissistic child. It does not matter how logically you argue. It does not matter how much evidence you present. They have already decided that their perspective is superior simply because it is theirs. So, your perspective is automatically inferior, regardless of its merit. And no conversation will change that, because the superiority does not come from rational evaluation. It comes from a narcissistic need to see themselves as superior. Seneca closed on this with a specific warning: do not spend your life trying to earn respect from someone who fundamentally sees you as inferior. Seek respect where it can be genuinely given and mutually received. Munchie. This does not mean abandoning your child. It means adjusting your expectations about what kind of relationship is possible with someone who sees you as fundamentally inferior to them. Seventh sign: distorts reality and practices gaslighting. There is something particularly disturbing about the narcissistic child: their ability to make you doubt your own reality. You had a clear conversation. They deny it ever happened. Something specific occurred. They completely changed the story. You said something explicitly. They insist you said the opposite. And they do it with such conviction, with such confidence, that you begin to doubt your own memory. Did that really happen that way? Did I really say that? Am I remembering this wrong? That doubt is exactly the goal. It is called gaslighting. And the narcissistic child practices it not necessarily with conscious malicious intent, but as an automatic function of their need to maintain a narrative in which they are perfect and you are the problem. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people who distort reality. The one who needs to constantly rewrite the past reveals that he cannot tolerate the truth of the present, so he constructs alternate realities where his image remains intact. That is exactly the function of narcissistic gaslighting. They cannot tolerate a reality in which they made a mistake, were hurtful, or showed imperfection. So they rewrite that reality in their mind, and they present the rewritten version with such conviction that it appears more real than what actually happened. Seneca observed this specifically. The liar knows he is lying. The one who practices gaslighting often believes his own distorted version, and that genuine belief is exactly what makes the distortion so convincing and so dangerous. That is the critical difference. A conscious liar can be exposed through inconsistencies. The narcissistic gaslighter genuinely believes their rewritten version because their mind has adjusted reality to protect their self-image. And now they operate from that adjusted reality. So when they deny that something happened, they are not consciously lying. They genuinely do not remember it because their mind erased what threatened their self-image. When they change the version of events, they are not deliberately manipulating. Their mind has already altered their memory to align with their need to be perfect. Epictetus taught something specific about protecting yourself from this. When someone constantly denies realities you know to be true, the problem is not your memory. It is their need to rewrite what they cannot tolerate. This is critical to recognize. When your narcissistic child constantly makes you doubt your memory, your first instinct is to question your own perception. Maybe I'm remembering it wrong. Maybe I exaggerated it in my mind. Maybe it wasn't as clear as I thought. But if it is a consistent pattern, if you are always the one who remembers wrong according to them, the problem is not your memory. It is their distortion of reality to protect their self-image. The practice that reveals whether this pattern is present is necessary for your sanity. Begin documenting important conversations or significant events, not publicly, not to use as evidence against them, but for yourself, so you can verify your own reality when they insist something never happened. When you document it, and later they deny it, you can check. No, this did happen. It's documented. My memory is accurate. That verification will not convince them, but it protects you from the erosion of trust in your own perception. Marcus Aurelius practiced this specifically with people who distorted reality. He did not try to convince them of the truth, because he recognized that their distortions served a psychological function that no evidence could overcome. Instead, he maintained internal clarity about what actually happened, and he operated from that clarity without needing them to validate it. Seneca also warned about the psychological cost of prolonged gaslighting. The one who is constantly made to doubt his own reality eventually loses trust in his own perception, and that loss is one of the deepest forms of psychological harm. That harm is real. It is not weakness if you have begun to doubt your own memory. It is the natural result of prolonged exposure to someone who consistently denies your reality. And protecting yourself from that harm is not optional. It is necessary for your mental health. Epictetus closed on this with clear instruction. Trust your own experience more than the denials of one who needs to distort reality. Your sanity depends on maintaining clarity about what truly happened, no matter how many times it is denied. That internal clarity is exactly what protects you from narcissistic gaslighting, not convincing them of the truth, but maintaining your own certainty about your experience. And that certainty is your right. Your memory is valid. Your perception is real, even when they insist it is not. Eighth sign: exploits others for personal gain. There is a devastating truth about how the narcissistic child sees the people in their life. They do not see them as whole human beings with needs, limits, and inherent worth. They see them as tools, as resources, as means to get what they want. And this fundamentally transactional perspective contaminates every relationship they have, including the one with you. You are not their parent in the sense of someone they love and respect for who you are. You are the source of the resources they need: money, validation, services, emotional support, problem solving. And as long as those resources keep flowing toward them, the relationship works from their perspective. When those resources stop flowing, when you set limits on what you will give, the relationship deteriorates immediately, not because they love you less, but because your usefulness has decreased. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people who value others only for their utility. The one who sees people as tools can never love genuinely, because love requires valuing someone for their essence, not for their function. And the one who sees only functions lives in a world populated by objects, not people. That is the deep loneliness of the narcissist. Surrounded by people, yet incapable of genuine connection with any of them. Because they do not see people. They see functions that satisfy their needs. And when a function stops satisfying those needs, it is discarded and replaced without real sense of loss. Because they never loved the person. They only valued the function. Seneca observed this specifically in narcissistic individuals. The exploiter never recognizes that he exploits. In his mind, he is simply receiving what he naturally deserves. And the one who does not give what he believes he deserves is selfish, not him, for demanding constantly. That is exactly the distortion in the narcissistic mind. When they constantly ask for favors, demand your time endlessly, expect you to solve their problems over and over, they do not see this as exploitation. They see it as their natural right, as what they deserve for being who they are. So when you finally set a limit on what you will give, they do not process it as, "My demands were excessive." They process it as, "You are selfish for not giving me what I deserve." And that narrative completely reverses reality. You, the one who has given constantly, are accused of selfishness. They, the one who has taken constantly, present themselves as the victim of your stinginess. Epictetus taught something specific about recognizing exploitation. Observe the pattern. Does this person only appear when they need something? Do they only contact you when they have a problem to be solved? Are they only close when they can extract resources from you? If the answer is yes, you do not have a relationship. You have a transactional arrangement where you give and they take. And that is not a relationship you are obligated to maintain, regardless of biological ties. The practice that reveals whether your child is exploiting you is brutally clear. Review the last 10 significant interactions you have had with them. How many were initiated by them asking for something: money, a favor, validation, rescue from consequences, a problem solved? How many were initiated by them with genuine interest in your well-being, without an agenda or need? If the ratio is overwhelmingly toward the first, you are not in a reciprocal parent-child relationship. You are being exploited in a one-sided arrangement where you provide constantly and they take constantly, with no real reciprocity. And most painfully, this has likely conditioned you to associate their contact with demands. When you see their name on your phone, your first feeling is not joy or connection. It is anxiety, anticipating what they will need this time, what problem they will bring, what favor they will ask. That is not a healthy relational dynamic. It is an exploitative one, where you have been trained to remain constantly available for their needs while yours are irrelevant. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific when he identified exploitative relationships. He set clear limits on what he was willing to give, based on reciprocity, not demand. If the relationship was genuinely reciprocal, limits were flexible because there was mutual giving and receiving. If the relationship was one-sided, limits were firm because he recognized that giving endlessly to someone who only takes helps no one. It does not help the giver, who becomes exhausted. And it does not help the taker, who is kept in patterns of dependency and entitlement. Seneca also warned specifically about the cost of allowing prolonged exploitation. The one who allows himself to be constantly exploited is not being generous. He is becoming complicit in maintaining the exploiter's destructive pattern. Because every time you rescue, every time you give without limit, you confirm their belief that they can take endlessly without giving anything back. That is the uncomfortable truth about constantly giving to a narcissistic child who only takes. You are not helping them, you are disabling them. You are confirming that they can live without reciprocity, without responsibility, without regard for others' needs. And that does not only destroy you, it also destroys them by preventing the development of genuinely adult functioning. Epictetus taught something radical about this. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to stop rescuing, because only when someone experiences the natural consequences of their choices can they learn to choose differently. This is devastatingly difficult when it is your child. Every part of you wants to rescue, fix, provide. But if you have been rescuing for years and the patterns only worsen, not improve, your rescuing is not helping. It is perpetuating exactly the patterns that need to end. The deepest truth about narcissistic exploitation is this: it will never be enough. You can give everything, your time, your money, your emotional energy, your resources, and when you finally have nothing left to give, you will not receive gratitude for what you gave. You will receive resentment for what you can no longer give, because the narcissistic child does not value what you gave. They only notice what you no longer provide. They do not appreciate the years of sacrifice. They focus only on the present moment when you set a limit. And that ingratitude, that entitlement that treats your exhaustion as selfishness, reveals clearly that it was never a relationship. It was always exploitation. Marcus Aurelius summarized this with devastating clarity. Do not expect gratitude from one who valued only what you could provide. When you can no longer provide, you will discover that you were never valued for who you are, only for what you gave. That realization is painful, but it is also liberating, because when you finally see that the relationship was always transactional from their side, you can adjust your expectations accordingly. You can stop giving while waiting for reciprocity that will never come. You can set firm limits without guilt, because you recognize that protecting yourself from exploitation is not selfishness. It is the only act that preserves your ability to remain functional for responsibilities that truly matter. Seneca closed on this with a question you must confront. How much more of yourself will you sacrifice by being an endless resource for someone who never valued you as a person? There is no universally correct answer to that question. But there is an honest, personal answer that only you can give. And that answer will determine whether you continue to be exploited or begin to protect yourself by setting limits that reflect your real worth. Ninth sign: constantly plays the victim to control. The narcissistic child has a specific skill they use with devastating effectiveness, turning every situation into a drama where they are the ultimate victim. It does not matter what actually happened. It does not matter who caused the problem. It does not matter who was genuinely hurt. At the end of their narrative, they are always the victim, and you are always the perpetrator. You set a reasonable limit. They victimize themselves. You're abandoning me. You never really supported me. You express a legitimate need. They victimize themselves. Everything is always about you. I never matter. You point out a problematic behavior. They victimize themselves. You're always attacking me. I can never do anything right for you. And this victimhood is not sincere. It is strategic. It is a perfectly calibrated tool designed to get exactly what they want. For you to retract the limit, ignore your need, or apologize for pointing out their behavior. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people who use victimhood as a weapon. The one who turns every situation into a drama where he is the victim reveals something specific. He has learned that performative suffering controls better than direct honesty. And as long as that performance works, he will never stop using it. That is the function of narcissistic victimhood. It is not a genuine expression of pain. It is a calculated performance designed to manipulate your response. And it works perfectly on parents with normal empathy. Because when you see your child presenting themselves as suffering, your parental instinct is to relieve that suffering. So you do exactly what they want. You retract the limit that caused their pain. And in that moment, you teach them that victimhood works perfectly to get what they want. So they use it more frequently, more dramatically, more strategically. Seneca observed this specifically in skilled manipulators. The one who has learned that tears achieve what arguments could not will use tears every time. Not because he genuinely suffers, but because it genuinely works. That is the perversity of narcissistic victimhood. It is not that they never suffer genuinely. It is that they have learned to weaponize even real suffering to gain control, and to mix genuine suffering with performative suffering until you can no longer tell which is which. So you respond to all of their suffering as if it were genuine, even when it is clearly manipulative. Because you fear invalidating real suffering if you assume it is performance. And that fear is exactly what they use to keep you controlled. Epictetus taught something specific about recognizing manipulative victimhood. Observe the pattern. Does the suffering appear specifically when you set a limit or express a need? Does it disappear immediately when you retract the limit? If so, it is not genuine suffering. It is a tool of control. That pattern observation is critical. Genuine suffering does not have an on-off switch based on whether it gets what it wants. Performative suffering does. You set a limit. Tears, drama, declarations of how deeply they suffer because of your abandonment. You retract the limit. Immediate relief. The suffering disappears as if it never existed. That pattern reveals clearly that the suffering was a tool, not a genuine experience. The practice that reveals whether your child uses victimhood manipulatively is uncomfortable but necessary. Set a small, reasonable limit, something you know is appropriate, but they will not like. Observe their response without immediately giving in. Do they respect the limit, even if it is uncomfortable? Or do they immediately victimize themselves, presenting as devastated by your cruelty? If they victimize themselves, hold the limit without giving in. Observe what happens. Does the suffering escalate dramatically to force you to give in? Or does it eventually subside, showing it was never as devastating as presented? If it is the first, you are seeing manipulative victimhood as a control strategy. And giving in to that strategy does not help them. It only confirms that it works perfectly. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific with people who used manipulative victimhood. He distinguished between genuine suffering, which deserved compassion, and performance, which required firm limits. For genuine suffering, presence, support, compassion without sacrificing necessary boundaries. For manipulative performance, firm limits without yielding, no matter how dramatic the presentation, because he recognized that yielding to manipulative victimhood does not relieve genuine suffering. It only trains the person to use victimhood more frequently as a control tool. Seneca also warned about the cost of constantly yielding to victimhood. The one who yields to every display of suffering without distinguishing between genuine and performative, eventually finds himself living completely controlled. Because the manipulator has learned that presenting as a victim grants absolute power. That is your reality if you have a narcissistic child who constantly victimizes themselves. Every limit you try to set is met with dramatic victimhood. Every need you express is turned into evidence of how much they suffer. Every necessary confrontation is transformed into your attack on their vulnerable self. And if you consistently give in, you are not being a compassionate parent. You are being a parent controlled by emotional manipulation. Epictetus closed on this with a radical instruction. When someone presents themselves as a victim of your reasonable limit, the problem is not your limit. It is their inability to tolerate that you exist with needs of your own that do not serve their convenience. That is the truth that liberates. Your reasonable limit does not victimize them. Their entitlement, the expectation that you should have no limits, creates their suffering. And that suffering is theirs to resolve, not yours to eliminate by yielding to unreasonable demands. Because every time you give in, you do not eliminate their suffering. You only postpone the next episode of victimhood that will appear the next time you set a limit. And that cycle will continue indefinitely until you recognize that victimhood is a tool of control that requires firm boundaries, not compassion that collapses. Marcus Aurelius summarized this perfectly. Compassion without limits is not virtue. It is vulnerability expertly exploited by manipulators. Your compassion is beautiful, but it requires wisdom to know when to apply it. Applied to genuine suffering, it is medicine. Applied to manipulative victimhood, it is poison that corrodes the relationship even further. And only you can make that distinction by observing patterns honestly instead of reacting automatically to every display of suffering. 10th sign. Cannot tolerate others' success without sabotaging it. There is something especially revealing about how the narcissistic child responds when someone close to them achieves something meaningful, not with genuine celebration, not with shared joy, not with pride in another person's success. With sabotage, sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious, but always present, because in the narcissistic mind, your success is their threat. They cannot tolerate you shining, because while you shine, they are no longer the center. They are no longer the most special. They are no longer the only one who matters. And this zero tolerance for others' success shows up in specific patterns you have likely experienced. Minimization, that's not that impressive. Lots of people do that. It's easier than it looks. Every comment is designed to shrink your achievement, to make it seem less meaningful than it truly is. Because if your achievement is significant, it threatens their need to be the only special one in the room. Criticism, but you should have, if you had done X, it would be better. It's not perfect because every critique is designed to find the flaw, to ensure that even in your moment of success, they maintain a superior position by pointing out what you did wrong. Shifting the focus. Immediately after your announcement, they have their own announcement, their own achievement, their own story that demands attention, designed to redirect the spotlight from your success back to them. Because they cannot tolerate you having the center of attention without reclaiming it, or direct sabotage. They find a way to ruin the moment. They create conflict. They generate drama. They do something that guarantees your celebration will be interrupted, because your joy is their discomfort. And they will eliminate your joy to eliminate their discomfort. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about people incapable of celebrating others' success. The one who cannot rejoice in the good of another reveals that his sense of worth depends entirely on comparison, and that dependence turns him into an enemy of every success that is not his own. That is the tragedy of the narcissist. They cannot enjoy the success of those they love, because their structure does not allow love that celebrates the other. It only allows transactional love, where the other exists to validate their greatness. So, when someone achieves success independently, it is not a reason for celebration. It is a threat that must be neutralized through minimization, criticism, or direct sabotage. Seneca observed this specifically in narcissistic individuals. The envious person does not suffer because of what he lacks. He suffers because of what others have. And that suffering drives him to destroy the good of others instead of building his own. That is exactly the dynamic of the narcissistic child with the success of siblings, parents, or anyone close. They do not work to achieve more themselves. They work to minimize or destroy the achievement of others. Because when their worth depends on being superior, any success in another is a direct threat, and eliminating the threat is easier than genuinely rising. Epictetus taught something specific about protecting yourself from this. Do not share your victories with those who cannot celebrate them, not out of revenge, but out of protection. Because the one who sabotages your joy does not deserve access to your vulnerable moments of celebration. This is devastatingly painful when it is your child. Your natural instinct is to share your successes with family, to seek shared celebration, to want your achievements to be recognized by those closest to you. But if your narcissistic child consistently sabotages every moment of success, sharing with them is not connection. It is vulnerability that will be weaponized against you. The practice that reveals whether this pattern is present is brutally clear. Think about the last times you shared a significant success with your child. How did they respond? With genuine joy? With sincere celebration? With pride in your achievement? Or with minimization, criticism, immediate shifting of focus to themselves, or the creation of conflict that ruined the moment? If it is the second, consistently, you are not seeing occasional insecurity. You are seeing a structural narcissistic incapacity to tolerate others, shining without sabotaging that light. Marcus Aurelius practiced something specific with people like this. He did not share personal victories with those who could not celebrate them genuinely, not out of cruelty, but because he recognized that sharing success with someone who sabotages it does not create connection. It creates an opportunity for harm that serves no one. So he reserved celebration for those capable of genuine joy in another's good. And he maintained relationships with saboteurs in neutral territory where personal success was not shared. Seneca also warned about the cost of seeking validation from those who cannot give it. The one who seeks celebration of his success from someone who envies that success is searching for water in the desert. And that futile search only deepens his thirst while exhausting him completely. That is your experience if you keep seeking genuine celebration from a narcissistic child. Every success you share, hoping for shared joy, is met with sabotage. And every sabotage leaves you more hurt, more confused, wondering why your own child cannot be happy for you. The answer is that their narcissistic structure makes that joy impossible. Your success threatens their need to feel superior. And that threat automatically activates sabotage. It is not personal in the sense that they specifically hate you. It is structural in the sense that any success in another triggers the same pattern. Epictetus closed on this with a liberating instruction. Celebrate your successes with those who can celebrate them with you, not with those who experience them as a personal threat. Your joy deserves safe ground, not a minefield where every victory will be sabotaged. That is the freedom you need to claim, to stop seeking from your narcissistic child what their structure makes impossible to give, to stop sharing vulnerably while hoping for celebration that will always turn into sabotage, to stop hurting yourself repeatedly by hoping that this time it will be different. It will not be different, because the pattern is not a conscious choice they can simply change. It is a personality structure that operates automatically, and protecting yourself from that pattern is not abandonment. It is recognizing what kind of relationship is possible and adjusting your expectations to reality. Marcus Aurelius summarized this with final wisdom. Accept people as they are, not as you wish them to be. And when you accept that someone cannot celebrate your success, you stop hurting yourself by expecting the impossible. That acceptance is not sad resignation. It is liberating clarity that allows you to protect your joy by sharing it only where it can be honored. And that protection is exactly the act of self-respect you need after years of giving to someone who only takes and sabotages. The truth you need to hear, even if it hurts. You have reached the end of these 10 signs, and if you were honest while listening, you likely recognized patterns that are painful to admit. Maybe you recognized all of them, maybe only some. Maybe you saw them with a devastating clarity you did not want to have. Because admitting that your child operates from narcissism is not simply acknowledging a label, it is admitting that the relationship you have is not the relationship you imagined, that it will probably never be the relationship you hoped for, that it will require stricter boundaries, lower expectations, and far stronger protection of your peace than any parent ever wants to need with their own child. And that admission is devastatingly painful. Marcus Aurelius wrote something about accepting painful truths about those close to us. Truth is preferable to comforting illusion, because only truth, however painful, allows you to operate from clarity rather than denial, and that clarity is the only foundation on which real protection can be built. That is exactly the invitation of these 10 signs. Not to cruelly pathologize your child, not to give up on the relationship entirely, not to abandon all hope, but to see, with brutal honesty, what you are actually facing. Because as long as you operate from denial, as long as you keep believing that if I just find the right way to reach them, they will change, you remain trapped in cycles that destroy you, giving more while waiting for reciprocity that will not come, justifying behaviors that should not be justified, blaming yourself for patterns you did not cause. And that cycle does not only destroy you, it perpetuates exactly the narcissistic patterns that require firm boundaries to be confronted. Seneca wrote something specific about the moment of awakening to painful realities. There is a moment in every life when you must choose between the comfort of denial and the pain of clarity. And although clarity hurts at first, it is the only path to real freedom. This is that moment for you. The moment when you choose between continuing in comforting denial about who your child is, or awakening to painful clarity about the narcissistic patterns they operate from. Denial is more comfortable right now. It allows you to keep hoping they will change. It protects you from admitting how dysfunctional the dynamic truly is. But that comfort has a massive cost. More years of your life spent in destructive cycles that will not improve. Clarity hurts now. It forces you to admit truths you did not want to admit. It requires you to let go of hopes you have been holding on to. But that clarity also frees you. It allows you to set necessary boundaries, protect your peace, and build the only type of relationship that is sustainable with a narcissistic person. One based on firm boundaries, not on hope for fundamental change. Epictetus taught something radical about relating to narcissistic individuals once the patterns are recognized. You cannot change their nature. You can only change your response to their nature. And when you change your response from constant rescue to firm boundaries, you do not abandon the relationship. You transform it into the only version that can be sustained. That transformation is exactly what you need. Not to give up completely, but to radically adjust what you expect, what you give, and what you tolerate. Boundaries where you once gave without limit. Clarity where you once operated from denial. Protection of your peace where you once sacrificed everything. And these adjustments are not abandonment of your child. They are the only act that preserves your ability to remain present in a sustainable way. Because if you continue in the current patterns, you will eventually collapse completely, and then you will not be able to be present at all. Marcus Aurelius also recognized something critical about parental guilt. Not every problem in a child is a reflection of failures in parenting. Some personality patterns develop despite reasonable upbringing. And accepting that is not abandoning responsibility. It is acknowledging reality. This is the liberation you need from the guilt you have likely carried for years. Not everything is your fault. Not every problem in your child exists because you failed as a parent. Narcissism has genetic, temperamental, and environmental components that go far beyond parenting alone. And while your parenting was not perfect, because no parenting ever is, that does not mean you caused their narcissism. You may have contributed to some patterns without being responsible for the entire structure. And distinguishing between what is genuinely your responsibility and what belongs to their personality structure is critical for your sanity. Seneca closed his writings on this with something freeing. You did what you could with the knowledge you had. And if you had known better, you would have done better. But you did not know. So you did your best imperfectly. And that effort deserves to be honored, not eternally punished. That is the grace you need to give yourself. You did your best with the knowledge and resources you had. It was not perfect, but it was your honest best, and that effort deserves recognition, not perpetual guilt. Epictetus closed his teachings on difficult relationships with a final instruction: love people as they are, not as you wish them to be. Because love based on who you wish someone were is not real love. It is attachment to fantasy. And that attachment keeps you in perpetual pain when reality does not match the fantasy. Well, that is the final act of love you need to practice with your narcissistic child. To love them as they are, not as you wish they were, not as you imagine they could be if they only changed, but as they are now. With all the narcissistic patterns they operate from, that love does not mean tolerating abuse. It does not mean giving endlessly. It does not mean sacrificing your peace. It means seeing them clearly, setting boundaries appropriate to who they are, and releasing expectations of who you wish they were. Because only when you release the fantasy can you relate to reality. And only when you relate to reality can you protect yourself appropriately. The 10 signs we explored are not a formal clinical diagnosis. They are behavioral patterns that indicate probable narcissism. And recognizing those patterns is the first step toward protecting yourself from constant manipulation. Not the last step, the first. Because after recognition comes the work of setting firm boundaries, maintaining them without yielding to manipulation, and building a life that does not depend on them changing. That work is long. It is difficult. It is painful in ways only parents in this situation truly understand. But it is the only work that leads to real freedom. Freedom from destructive cycles. Freedom from inappropriate guilt. Freedom from hope that keeps you trapped. Marcus Aurelius lived this final wisdom. Do what is within your control. Release what is not. And learn to distinguish between the two with brutal clarity. Within your control. Your boundaries. Your responses. Your protection of your peace. Your decision to operate from clarity. Outside your control. Their narcissistic structure. Their choice to change or not change. Their response to your boundaries. And when you operate from that distinction, when you do your part without trying to control theirs, you find a peace that does not depend on them changing. That peace is your right, your need. Your only way to survive this relationship sustainably. And protecting that peace fiercely is not selfishness. It is the only act that allows you to remain a parent without destroying yourself in the process. You have permission to set boundaries. You have permission to protect your peace. You have permission to release guilt that does not belong to you. And you have permission to love your child exactly as they are, from a safe distance, with firm boundaries that preserve your ability to continue loving sustainably. That is the only kind of love that survives a relationship with a narcissist. Not love that gives endlessly until it collapses, but love that gives wisely, within limits that protect the giver. And that love, though different from what you imagined, is the only real love possible in this situation. Seneca offered final words that summarize all of this. To live well is the greatest act of love. And when you live well by establishing necessary boundaries, you do not abandon the one you love. You show them, by example, what a sustainable life looks like. And that example is worth more than all the rescuing you could ever do. Live well, protect your peace, set firm boundaries, not as abandonment, but as the only sustainable act of love possible. And that act, however difficult, is exactly what both you and your child need. You, to survive. They, to finally encounter real limits in a world that will not yield endlessly the way you have. Those limits are love, even if they do not feel like love right now. They are the deepest form of love. The kind that loves enough to tell the truth, even when it hurts. And that truth is this: enough. I will not tolerate more manipulation. I will not give endlessly. I will not sacrifice my peace. I love you. And because I love you, I will set the boundaries we both need, even if I am the only one who recognizes it right now. Your voice matters here more than you think. Every insight you share strengthens and elevates this community, because this isn't just another space. It's a circle of people who choose to live with intention, with discipline, and with character. Each of you leaves a mark, and the reflection that receives the most support will be pinned as a banner of who we are. Not as decoration, but as a reminder of the kind of warrior who chooses to think, feel, and act with stoic clarity. Because this is a community that doesn't run from pain, it walks through it with courage. A community that doesn't look for cheap comfort, it seeks wisdom. A community that doesn't break under adversity, it turns it into strength. And if you've made it this far, it's because something inside you is already shifting. Something is waking up. Something is asking for more. So, before you leave, check the description. There you'll find the paths we created to help you keep strengthening your mind. They're not there by accident. Each one exists to help you go deeper, build inner resilience, and return again and again to that place within you where nothing and no one can take your peace. Subscribing isn't doing the podcast a favor. It's an act of respect toward yourself. It's choosing not to live on autopilot anymore. It's committing to think differently, to feel with more order, to live with more intention. Because every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, we publish reflections designed to stay with you when life gets heavy, when your mind gets loud, when you need a reminder of who you are. Not following us means risking missing the one lesson you might need in the hardest moment. And if you choose to go a step further, if you choose to become a member, understand one thing clearly. You're not donating, you're sustaining a mission. Because of you, this flame stays alive. Because of you, we can keep spreading Stoicism as a refuge for millions who are fighting not to give up. Your support is what keeps this podcast alive, strong, and growing. You're not a spectator, you're part of the foundation holding this community together. I'll see you in our next Stoicism for Winners session, where we'll keep exploring the depth of Stoic wisdom applied to everyday life. In the meantime, dive into the recommended sessions in the description and continue your path. And until we cross paths again, don't forget this. You are the master of your perception, the guardian of your peace, and the warrior of your own battle. That is the legacy of Stoicism. That is the art of becoming invincible.